Among Us has had a number of video game crossovers over the years, from major games like Fortnite and Fall Guys to lesser known games like Knockout City, Henry Stickmin, and Monster Prom. One place I never really expected to see an Among Us crossover is Vampire Survivors, but that is exactly what the Emergency Meeting DLC is. It's a bit of a strange crossover in my mind, but one thing is for certain, you won't find any vampires here. That said, is the DLC worth it, or does this one go a bit too strange from the base theme? If you've purchased any of the previous Vampire Survivors DLC, then you're going to be familiar with what Emergency Meeting brings to the table here. It adds a new map, enemies, characters, weapons, evolutions, passive items, music, and even a new adventure for the newly released Adventure Mode. After purchasing the DLC, you will have access to the new map, Polis Replica, which is based off the Among Us map Polis. It's a fairly large map and will also have tasks for you to do while playing on it, which will require stepping on a red circle somewhere on the map. This will reward you with a treasure chest. On this new map, you will find a coffin that will unlock your first of 9 new playable characters. These are all based off the different colors and roles you can find in Among Us. So you have characters like crewmate Dino and imposter Rena. It was pretty impressive how much character the developers were able to give each of these characters, since they're all based off the Among Us crewmate character shape. By doing various accomplishments that you can find in the unlock menu, you will be able to unlock new characters and weapons as you play. This is just like in the base game, so you should be pretty familiar with this by the time you're getting to a DLC or a potential third DLC if you've bought the other two. Speaking of weapons, Emergency Meeting presents you with 8 new weapons, 7 new evolutions, and one of these weapons has a form added by the Gemini Arcana in the game. There are also 8 new passive items in the game. Most of these, with the exception of one, are used to evolve the new weapons. All of these weapons are connected to various tasks or aspects of Among Us. I was again impressed at how creative they were with the weapons in this game. They all felt very unique and incorporated Among Us in some very cool and unique ways. The mini crewmate passives are perhaps the weirdest addition to the DLC. They are needed to evolve the new weapons, but it's kind of unclear what they do. They all follow you around when you get them, and each have their own weapon from the game that they use. It's a very different approach to a passive, and I'm honestly not sure what I think about them. They're kind of useful, but I'm kind of wondering if they would be as good as some of the original passives that you get from the base game. The DLC also adds more music, which any fan of Vampire Survivors will enjoy because the Vampire Survivors music is really good. They always go hard with the music, and this DLC is no exception. They do some really good and unique mixes of Vampire Survivors and Among Us music, and it's really fascinating and really fun to listen to. This leads us to the question, is this DLC worth it? To be honest, Emergency Meeting is not my favorite DLC for Vampire Survivors. It manages to work somehow, but the theme just doesn't fit as well as the other 2 DLCs in my opinion. As I said, I just never would have expected an Among Us crossover with Vampire Survivors, and the themes just weren't ones that I would necessarily connect. Now that doesn't mean that the DLC isn't fun though. The new map, the new characters, and the new weapons are all a lot of fun to play around with. Sure, the characters are very similar, but they've also been made as distinct as possible, I feel. I've also got some mixed feelings on the passive items. They're interesting, but it also adds a lot of passives to the pool, and I'm not sure you'd want to replace many of the base passives with these options. Even though I do have mixed feelings about this DLC more than the previous ones, I would still say it is worth it. It's an interesting crossover DLC that fans of Vampire Survivors and Among Us can really enjoy. You may not enjoy this much if you're not familiar with Among Us, but it is still more Vampire Survivor goodness, and there is still a lot of fun to be had with this DLC. It's maybe a step back from the excellent Tides of the Foscari that had managed to add a sense of narrative to the DLC, but it's still a fun romp with more weapons and characters to play around with in the ever-growing arsenal of Vampire Survivors.